In June of 1272, during the waning days of the 8th Crusade, chaos would erupt in the holy city of Acre when an assassin, sent from the mysterious Hashshashin, almost killed Prince Edward of England, the man who history would come to know as King Edward Longshanks, or the Hammer of the Scots. The assassin had a reputation for evasion, and this one managed to sneak his way into Edward's chambers and nearly killed him while he was about to go to sleep. Edward would survive this brush with death, but would carry the scars from this attack for the rest of his life, and the assassins would cement their infamy in history. Had this assassin been successful, then the history of England would have been fundamentally altered, as King Edward would go on to have such a massive impact on the British Isles and its culture. The assassins would slip into legend, but their infamy was felt throughout Persia, Syria, and Europe. This is the story of how that assassin nearly changed world history, and how Edward solidified his reputation as a highly capable and formidable warrior. Our story begins in 1270, when the King of France, Louis IX, launched the 8th Crusade against the Hafsid dynasty of Tunisia, with around 60,000 men under his command. This was Louis's second attempt on crusade, having actually been captured by the Mamluks and then ransomed in 1250 during the 7th Crusade. This brief stint in captivity, however, didn't deter Louis from continuing his efforts, and he wanted another shot at the Muslims. The 8th Crusade did not see any significantly large battles or fighting though, as King Louis would die very early on from dysentery while besieging the city of Tunis on August 25th of 1270. His death would mark the end of major Christian armies' efforts in the Holy Land. King Louis would later be anointed as Saint Louis for his many pious efforts while king. The crusade was then marred by political infighting, intrigue, and disease, and ultimately lacked a clear path to any kind of success. Edward would arrive in Syria on May 9th of 1271, landing in the city of Acre with a little more than 1,000 men under his command, including 225 knights. He would immediately begin efforts to strengthen the defenses of Acre against the Mamluks, who controlled much of the Holy Land and the city of Jerusalem. The Mamluks, who were led by the Sultan Baybars, were besieging Acre when Edward arrived, and almost immediately abandoned the siege once Edward landed. Edward then began to launch small raids against the Mamluks, being unable to face them directly in a major battle due to his much smaller force. Later in the year, Edward successfully took the coastal city of Nazareth, which did little to weaken the fighting capabilities of the Mamluks. He then followed this up with a raid on the town of Saint-Georges-de-l'Abienne, which is modern-day Deir al-Assad, accomplishing little more than destroying some cattle fields, while also losing many of his men to the heat of the desert. Additional Christian forces would then later arrive from England, led by Edward's younger brother Edmund, as well as others who were under the command of King Hugh III of Cyprus, who was in fact the nominal Christian king of Jerusalem. Emboldened by this, Edward then led an attack on the town of Kukwan, surprising a force of Turkomans who had been integrated into the Mamluk forces earlier on, killing one of their emirs and around 1,500 soldiers. However, Edward failed to take the castle at Kukwan and retreated before the main force of the Mamluks, led by Baybars, could respond. Beyond this, the Crusaders accomplished little else other than raids and small skirmishes with the Mamluks. Coupled with the political infighting and the lack of significant victories, the Crusaders were in a terrible position by 1272, and this wasn't something that was lost on Edward. In fact, he was growing quite disillusioned with the whole thing, and was questioning the reasons for the crusade by that time. Prior to the assassination attempt, Edward and the Crusaders had now been pretty much confined to the city of Acre after fighting the Mamluk forces to a stalemate. Edward and King Hugh would then secure a 10-year truce between the Christians and Muslims, known as the Treaty of Caesarea. This ceasefire wasn't something Edward entirely agreed with, however, and he was openly defiant to it, which caused much strife between him and King Hugh. The assassination attempt took place at night, when Edward was settling in for bed with his wife Eleanor. It's not entirely clear how the assassin was able to make his way into the castle and then sneak into Edward's chambers, but the assassins were known for their evasion skills and their abilities to bypass sentries. The Order of Assassins, also known as the Hashshashin, were masters at the art of infiltration, and before this, they had stalked the Sultan Saladin to the point of madness, forcing him to flee to Egypt for a time. Since their inception in 1090, the assassins had killed hundreds of Christians and Muslims alike, and cultivated a respectable reputation of fear throughout Persia and Syria. Just as the prince and his wife were getting to sleep, the assassin attacked Edward with a dagger, stabbing him several times on his forearm. Edward then sprang into action defending himself, and was able to wrestle the dagger away from the assassin. He then brutally smashed the attacker's face in with a metal tripod, and finished him off by driving the dagger into the assassin's head, killing him instantly. Edward was one of the greatest knights in Europe by this time, and he was a massive man, standing over 6 feet tall. Had he been anything less than the warrior that he was, then the assassin probably would have killed him. He was immediately concerned that the dagger was poisoned, and legend has it that his wife actually sucked the poison from his wounds as the Templar surgeons rushed to his aid. Edward was lucky to be alive, as the assassins weren't known for their failed attempts, and the castle would be put on high alert following this. Since Edward had killed the assassin, there was no way to know who was behind the attack, as he wasn't able to be tortured for further information. Following the attempt on his life, Edward was greatly weakened by the attack, and was treated for infection by the Templars, but refused to leave Acre, even when encouraged to do so by his wife and fellow crusaders. Edward wasn't the type to let his enemies think he was afraid, and he was resolved to stay in Acre, and see that the treaty with the Mamluks would hold up. However, by September of that year, whether due to the political infighting, the possibility of a second assassination attempt, his continued weakening state, or all factors, Edward finally relented and took his retinue to Sicily. He left Acre on September 24th of 1272. Edward's departure marked the end of significant military campaigns by Christians into the Holy Land, and finally ending an era of crusades that had gone on for more than 200 years. Initially, Edward was intent on returning to the Holy Land once he was fully recovered. However, fate would intervene, and when he arrived in Sicily, he was informed that his son John had died, followed by even worse news that his father, King Henry III, had died as well on November 16th of 1272. Recognizing the political importance of the situation, he then began the long journey back to England, intent on taking the throne and putting to rest the issues with the English barons, who were a constant threat to peace and stability, having already fought a civil war with them in 1264 that was particularly brutal. By the time he set out for England, he was nearly fully recovered, and carried the scar from the attack as a stern reminder to always be on his guard. His journey back to England took him through Italy, then southern France, putting down a rebellion on the way in Gascony, then finally stopping in Paris before making his way to the British Isles. His experiences on Crusade no doubt played into his thinking as well, since he had seen firsthand how infighting had wrecked the Crusaders' ability to achieve victory, and he was intent on settling the political issues facing England once and for all. Edward would go on to be crowned the King of England on August 19th of 1274 at Westminster Abbey. The Order of Assassins would be annexed by Sultan Baybars in 1273, and then fully disbanded by 1275. The true reason for the assassination attempt on Edward was never confirmed, though most historians agree that it was probably Sultan Baybars who ordered the hit on Edward. Still, the possibilities remain that it could have been the Order of Assassins themselves. Nonetheless, this attempt on Edward solidified the assassins' place in history, and they would go on to inspire the critically acclaimed video game series Assassin's Creed. The Christians would never return to the Holy Land after these events, and the 8th Crusade was the last time the Muslims would have to defend the Holy Land from major invasions from the Christians. King Edward would go on to be one of the most influential European monarchs in history, and had a profound effect on English culture and the legal system. His legal reforms inspired the other monarchs of Europe to adopt similar systems, and this changed the nature of politics in Europe, laying the foundations for the modern rule of law as we know it today. Edward would also consolidate power in the British Isles later in his reign, bringing both Ireland and Wales under British control, and waging devastating wars against Scotland. Edward, his wife Eleanor, and their children also helped to secure dynastic claims across Europe, and their legacy is still very much felt to this day. The assassins would slip into legend, and the story of Edward's brush with death would pass into history as a moment when the fate of England and that of Europe could have been fundamentally altered. It's events like these that make history so incredibly interesting and worth learning about, as stories from the past tend to be almost better than fiction, and in many ways go on to inspire the fiction genre. If you've made it this far, then I sincerely appreciate you watching. It's viewers like yourself that help this channel to continue to grow, and I hope to bring more content like this as time goes on. If you enjoyed the video, then please leave a like or comment, and consider subscribing for future content. This has been Valen from History Vita, and until next time, have a great day.